Today is May the 31st, 2026, which means that today is the last day of my 9th year as the pastor of Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, having come here on June the 1st, 2017. Grace Fellowship Baptist Church is a unique place. We are a confessional Reformed Baptist church. We hold to a high view of Scripture, a high view of God, a high view of His ways. And it has been my great honor for these past 9 years to have served as the teaching elder of this church alongside these other 6 men, elders both past and present, that I have had the joy of serving alongside of, and I am thankful and honored to you for your support, for your prayers, for your love, for the opportunity to spend time with you and talk with you about deep and important things. It is indeed a great joy and honor to serve in this capacity. And I pray that the Lord will give me many more years to go, because it will take at least 10 to get through 1 Corinthians. And so I would ask you, if you would please, in that vein, to turn back with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And let me remind you that Paul is in the midst of a great appeal where he is seeking for the church at Corinth to be unified around Christ. They have divided themselves up under certain speculative or imaginary heads. They have purposely defied unity by aligning themselves with various personalities. And Paul has turned his attention during the course of the letter to what he considers to be the true unifying center of the church. Just as an aside, I believe that the first letter that Paul wrote, that we don't have before this one, was probably Paul's attempt to deal with this issue in a very different way, which the Lord himself did not inspire. It was not the means. More likely, Paul tried to attack it strictly from a pragmatic perspective. But in this case, Paul says, okay, let's focus on what is truly at the center of the Christian life, and that is the cross of Christ. Paul says in verse 17, I came not to preach baptism or to set up some sort of ritual center. I came to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. I came to preach the cross of Christ. And he points out, as I noted, that this idea of a cross being the means by which men would be saved would be a preposterous idea to the majority of those who would have been in Corinth at the time. A device of torturous execution acting as a source of hope is preposterous. It's ridiculous to those who are religiously pious. But to Paul, the fullness of the cross is the fullness of the wisdom and power of God. And so, as I suggested to you, that what Paul is saying to us out of these words is that genuine Christian unity demands humility. A humility that is based on a common focus on the cross. That our focus is not on ourselves, but rather on Him. To focus on petty divisions over personalities or other kinds of things diminishes the true wisdom of God. Real wisdom comes from humbling oneself before the awesome wisdom of God. And as we turn to look at verses 19 and beyond, I pointed out that Paul puts a principle out of that thinking before his audience, and he says that he asserts that God's wisdom is infinitely higher than our own, and to focus inwardly on ourselves, to focus on our own wisdom, is to miss the grandness of His. When we're so inwardly focused, we miss Him and His grandness. And to make his point, he works through a very strong rhetorical structure To make this point, he starts by quoting from Isaiah 29, specifically verse 14, to illustrate this biblically. I mean, after all, God has said this before. Not the first time that God has said this. God has said this. And God has done some very counterintuitive things with his people over time. Yes, they're going to reject me, but I'm going to do great and mighty things in their presence. And so while this idea of a cross might be counterintuitive, that the wisdom of God is seen in the cross might be counterintuitive, the fact is, it's not the first time God has said these things. And then Paul poses a series of rhetorical questions which are designed to seek out whether or not this principle is true. Look around you. Do you see any genuine wisdom in this world? Do you see men thinking rightly about things? Are they drawing the right conclusions from the evidence that's all around them? And of course, what is the answer to that question? No. The world is filled with foolishness. But these questions are designed to promote his idea. God's wisdom is infinitely higher than ours. Men don't get it. They stumble around in the dark looking for it. But then in verse 21, he states his principle straight out. For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, meaning its wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach, that is a cross, to save those who believe. Here it is. Men are foolish and they flounder around in the dark looking for God, or looking for hope, or looking for something. But God's wisdom shows up in the foolishness of a cross. God's wisdom comes in the foolishness of a cross. So he's given us three of the steps that he's making in this rhetorical argument, but there is another, and it's step 4, which starts in verse 22. When Paul says, for Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. So what Paul will do here, as a part of a typical first century rhetorical approach, is after stating his point, he will then pose some counterexamples to say, let me show you some examples of the opposite of what I'm talking about, so it helps make my point. Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. Now, 2 notes first before we dive into what this verse is saying. 2 things that I want you to notice. Number 1, it is quite clear that Paul is speaking pejoratively about these things in this verse, okay? Signs in and of themselves are not inherently wrong. And seeking wisdom is clearly a good thing. I mean, after all, is it not the point that he's making, right? Seek the wisdom of God. Okay. So signs and wisdom, seeking signs and seeking wisdom, is not inherently evil in themselves. Paul is, of course, here speaking of these things as they are corrupted by fallen men. But he's not inherently saying that signs are bad or wisdom is bad. Two examples, one on each side. The 4th gospel, the Gospel of John, is a book written specifically to show the signs that Jesus did to demonstrate who he was. I mean, John writes that explicitly in chapter 20, doesn't he? There are many more signs that Jesus did, but these are written so that you may know that he is the Son of God, and that by believing in his name you might have eternal life. The point of the book is to say, let me show you the signs that Jesus did to demonstrate who he is. Right? The first of them at Cana, probably the greatest at Bethany. So, signs themselves are not inherently a bad thing. And the same is true with wisdom. The book of Proverbs is built upon the fundamental principle that wisdom is a good thing, right? The fear of God begins with wisdom. So the writer of Proverbs is clearly making this case. And so Paul would understand that to be true. So although these things are normally good things to seek, Paul is clearly using them as counterexamples, pointing to their corruption or the corruption of their seeking by those who have missed the true wisdom and power of God. Okay, that's what he's doing. So he's not saying that signs are bad or wisdom is bad. The point is that wisdom is good, seek it, but he's pointing to how it's corrupted use. Second, although Paul will assign signs to Jews and wisdom to Greeks, that is not to imply that no Greek ever seeks a sign or no Jew ever seeks wisdom. Okay, he's not saying that Jews only seek signs and Greeks only seek wisdom. He's not saying that. What he's saying is, based on my interactions and experiences at Corinth, for example, as I encountered the Jews of the synagogue and as I encountered the Greeks living in the city, what did I discover? I discovered that, Jews have a tendency to demand that we prove it by sign, and Greeks have a tendency to say, well, let's think about this. Okay? So he's not just limiting it to one particular kind of people demanding signs and so forth. He's simply using this as an example. Okay? All right. So what does he mean when he says Jews demand signs? Now, here's what he's saying. Jews, in their resistant state against Jesus as Messiah, all right, in that context, in their resistant state against Jesus as Messiah, what they do is demand visible, outward, testable evidence to prove the gospel is true. They're asking me to prove that the cross is the means of their salvation. Show me in some tangible sense that what you say is true. Do a miracle to prove that this is the case. Show it in some tangible way. You remember that this was a common request amongst the Jews of Jesus' day. It was something that came quite often, particularly out of the Jews, okay, which means the leadership people of Israel in that day. Matthew chapter 12, verse 38, and chapter 16, verse 1, they come to him and say, show us a sign. Prove who you are. If you say who you say you are, then prove it by signs. And it's interesting that Jesus' response to that is, well, you're an evil and adulterous generation. And the only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah, which, of course, John then goes on to explain means his time in the belly of the earth after his death before his resurrection. That's the only sign I'm going to give you. Even though, ironically, he's doing sign after sign after sign, as John points out. In essence, they had refused to heed his word. They wouldn't take him at his word, you see. They wanted something more substantial. So Jesus refuses to do some sort of immediate miracle because he knew it would make no difference to their hardened hearts. He knew it would make no difference to his hardened hearts. I'll give you one example. John chapter 11. I believe that the raising of Lazarus from the dead is the single greatest sign that Jesus did in his public ministry. Okay, it's not greater than his own resurrection. Okay. But if you had to pick out a miracle that Jesus did during the course of his public ministry, what would you point to as the single greatest thing that any human being could do to prove that he's God? Answer, to stand in front of a tomb and face down a man who's been dead for 4 days and call him to come forth from the tomb. The greatest sign of his public ministry. But what effect did that have on those who were asking for a sign? It hardened them even more, even to the point that John specifically notes that after Jesus had done this, they go out seeking a way to kill him. They go out seeking a way to kill him. Why? That doesn't make any sense, does it? Why would they do that? Why would they call for this man's death? Well, we all know the answer to that, or we should. Because you see, because they knew that if Jesus could in fact raise up dead men, then they're out of a job. They're no longer going to be the center of religious life in Jerusalem. They're no longer going to be the power brokers. People are not going to flock to them anymore. They're going to flock to him. And Jesus knew that. He knew that. A great twist that would come here at this point is this. The single greatest sign of all time, the sign of Jonah, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, had already been given. It had already been testified to by many witnesses, and it was the foundation of a great and undeniable religious movement amongst the Jews. Paul says, and yet they still ask for a sign. I go to the synagogue in Corinth, and I preach that Jesus is alive. He's been seen by many. I myself, Paul says, have seen him personally. And what's their response? Show me a sign. Prove it. The single greatest sign of all time. The proof, in fact, of the power of the cross is found in the resurrection. And Paul undoubtedly had preached it in the synagogues. The sign for them would have been the vast number of Jews who had come to see Jesus as their Messiah and Lord by the effective power of the Spirit of God. That should have been a massive sign for them to have seen. So when Paul says Jews demand sign, he's condemning the ongoing request of those who want more. Even as Jesus himself told the story of the rich man in Hades in Luke chapter 16. Abraham said to the rich man in Hades, if your still living brothers do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Jesus Christ has come forth alive from a tomb. He's been witnessed to by hundreds in his own day, and millions upon millions upon millions, an innumerable number of people since that day of resurrection have had their lives inextricably changed by it. What greater sign could be given? What could God do even greater than that? Nothing. That's what Paul means when he says the Jews demand signs. It's a counterexample because these people are still walking around dead and blind and can't see right in front of them the very thing that would convince them. What else could he do that would somehow change their minds? It doesn't make any sense, right? That's the point. The wisdom of God has been fully displayed in the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. It's the ultimate sign of God's power, but it requires what? Humility, which leads to faith, which leads to surrender and submission. That's what it means. We don't have to walk around demanding a miracle, nor should we, because God has already done the single greatest thing human history has ever seen. Now, let me be clear. This is a condemnation of the Corinthians. He's not just condemning the Jews' demand signs, okay? He's writing to the Corinthian church, and these words are being pressed against them. In a sense, see, they have turned from the centrality of the sign of the cross and the resurrection to their own petty issues, their own petty grievances, their own little things that have divided them up under certain personalities. They've already turned from the most important thing in the history of the world to their own little whatevers. And they're now being unified, or dare I say divided, over trivial things far less significant. The focus on whatever triviality they think is keen to them is tantamount to saying, our sign of unity is whatever petty issue we think is of key importance at the moment. Whatever we think is important at this moment, that's our sign, you see. So Paul condemns the Corinthians in this phrase by condemning what they seek. But then he turns and says, and Greeks seek wisdom. Now, in this case, what he's talking to, of course, is the kind of people who would have certainly lived in Corinth at the time. Remember, Corinth is a Grecian city. It's in the Greek world, so it's part of the Greek islands, okay? And so here he is. He's in this place. And as you know, they had a fascination with their philosophical musings about God. And what they demand then is intellectually sound, testable theories to prove the gospel is true, that the cross is a means of salvation. So describe to us in some philosophically coherent sense what you say is true. Where the Jew says, prove it by some sort of miracle, the Greek comes along and says, prove it by some sort of great intellectual thought that we've never thought of, some amazing sense. It was a common issue amongst the Greeks of the day, the so-called philosophically minded. Before Paul got to Corinth, he stopped in Athens, you remember, the center of Greek philosophy in the first century. And he went up on Mars Hill. Remember the Areopagus? He went up to the center of Athenian philosophy, which is, by the way, just about 50 miles north of Corinth as the crow flies. So it's not far at all. And he went there and spoke to them preached to them about the unknown God. And he told them, didn't he? Well, I know who that God is. You don't, but I know who he is because I know who the true creator and judge is in the resurrection of Jesus. And when he said that, they sneered at the preposterous idea of a man being raised from the dead because it was contrary to their philosophical, boy, that's easy for you to say, philosophical understanding of the mystical nature of man. We understand who men are. You see, Greek philosophy, generally speaking, not always and not completely, but generally understood the human condition as something from which to be freed. See, it's good that we're human, that's fine, but our real importance lies in who we are immortally, in our souls, you see. And so the outward nature is irrelevant, which means we're really free to go and do in this world whatever we want to do. In case you haven't figured it out, that's exactly why the various temple systems of Greek philosophy are surrounded by so much sexual immorality. We can do with this body whatever we want to. Because all that matters is what's inside. All that matters is the soul, you see. And so the general idea of salvation was to be freed from this physical nature and return to the purity of the spiritual. Thus, the idea of salvation, of true liberty, coming through a man being physically crucified and then being physically raised back into his human condition was preposterous. That's why they sneered at him when he spoke of the resurrection. Paul, you're telling me that this man came back to life as a man? And that is the hope that we have? That's ridiculous. Now, by the way, in case you didn't remember, this perspective infiltrated the church in the 2nd and 3rd century. It became a real problem all the way up to the days of Athanasius. The Arian movement had to deal with this reality until quite literally Athanasius stood against the world in the nature of Christ as human. In other words, Greeks come at this discussion of salvation from a purely esoteric point of view. Salvation is not some sort of physical reality, but it's simply a state of mind to be achieved through understanding and deeper knowledge. Some of us get it, some of you don't. You sit there in your little ignorance, and what do you know? But look at us. We're up here on the Areopagus, musing away. In other words, Paul says they seek wisdom. Notice the scare quotes. which is simply a way of thinking about the human condition. But their thoughts lead nowhere. The wisdom of God has been fully displayed in the physical death and resurrection of Jesus, the ultimate form of wisdom. But what does it require? It requires humility and an outward focus to see. You see, if I'm only focused on me, if I'm only focused on my understandings of things, I'm going to miss the wisdom of God. If I think I'm wise, I'm going to miss the wisdom of God. The Greeks, look at them. They come up with theory after theory after theory after theory after theory. None of it makes sense. None of it actually accomplishes a thing. They just do a lot of talking. But God has spoken. And he has spoken through a cross and the resurrection of a man from the dead. And his wisdom is on display in it. Now again, this too is a condemnation of the Corinthians. Sure, he's condemning the Greeks and he's condemning the Jews, but he's also condemning the Corinthians. Because in a sense, they have turned from the hard realities of the cross and the resurrection to their own esoteric issues. They've been unified under some sort of thing that they're thinking about. Well, we follow Paul, we follow Apollos, we follow Peter, we follow whatever. We have our little ways of thinking. We're different from those guys. We're different from those guys. We're different from those guys. We have our own little way of thinking, you see. So Paul's condemning that. The focus on whatever triviality they think is keen to them is tantamount to their saying, our thoughts on any particular subject is of key importance at the moment. You see, how we think about it is what matters. How we think about it is what matters. So Paul brings in 22 some counterexamples, which then he flips over in verse 23 with that great word, but. That is how they think, but this is what we preach. And what we preach is Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. We preach what causes reprobate men either to, 1, stumble over, or 2, consider foolish. This word stumbling block in the Greek is a word scandalon. Sound familiar to you? Scandalon. Yes, we do get our word scandal from this word directly from the Greek. But the word means a trap, or an offense, or literally, according to the lexicons, something which rises up from the earth that you trip over on the way. You know, that Lego toy that the child left in the hallway that you didn't notice when you went to bed. Right? A scandalous assertion. A scandalous assertion. Now, this word is key in understanding, and I'm going to string together here 3 specific quotes of Scripture. Isaiah 8:14 and 15. Matthew 21:43 and 44. And Romans 9:30 and following. Now listen to these words and listen carefully to how this is being used to help you understand what he's saying. From Isaiah, and he, that is the Christ, will become a sanctuary. Now, you could put the words for some right there. He will become a sanctuary for some. And a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel. A trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many shall stumble on it. They shall fall and be broken. They shall be snared and taken. Through the prophet, God speaks and says, the one that I'm going to send, the promised one, is going to become to many something that rises up from the dirt that they trip over. A snare, a trap. Jesus then says this, from Matthew 21. And the one who falls on this stone, and he's clearly referring to himself there, I am the stone, me. He who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. And when it, that would be the gospel, when it, the message that comes from me, falls on anyone, it will crush him. There's two possibilities when you come to Jesus. One is you trip over him and stumble on him. The other is that he crushes you into humility before him. That's what Jesus means. This stumbling stone can be one of two things. It could be a stumbling block to you that you trip over and fall, or it could be something that crushes you and makes you humble. And then Paul concludes the thought from Romans chapter 9 by saying, what shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it, that is, a righteousness is by faith, but that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They have stumbled over the stumbling stone. Paul's assessment of the unbelieving Jews of his day was, when the Christ came to them, and they should have recognized him, instead, he became a trap, a snare, literally something they tripped over. They missed it. The Jews cannot accept, going back to Paul's point here, the Jews cannot accept the idea of their Messiah as being crucified as a criminal. To be hung on a tree is to be cursed, according to the law. Cannot accept the idea that the one promised to us by God would be crucified and die on a cross. Can't go there. They cannot see the cross. See, notice, with eyes to see. They cannot see the cross acting as their atonement because they believe the law is their atonement. Because they run back to Moses. In their self-righteousness, they become fools. For their self-righteousness and the law cannot save them, no matter how hard they try. Only a humble submission to the work of Christ on a cross by faith can save them. Only by this stone falling on them and crushing their self-righteousness and humbling them before God can save them. Paul says, Christ crucified is a stumbling block to those who would rely upon their own self-righteousness, who would look upon themselves as righteous before God rather than being humbled before a bloody cross. And not only is the preaching of the cross crucified a stumbling block to Jews, but it's also folly to the Greeks. In this case, Paul changes the word to Gentiles because he expands, I think, the idea of who he's talking about here. Jews on this side, everybody else on that side. He doesn't narrow it just to Greeks. But as we've already noted, as I pointed out to you last sermon or the one before, this word folly is used a number of places in this text. As you know, it means silliness, but it's derived from a word that means someone who is dull or morose or a buffoon. Okay, it's foolish. The thinking of a foolish man, in other words. That's what this is. It's a folly. And obviously, those who philosophically could not agree with Paul thought he was a buffoon, right? Because they couldn't understand, by virtue of their blinded minds and hearts, of what he was saying. In this case, Paul is simply saying what I've already been saying before, that the Gentiles cannot accept the idea of a crucifixion leading to life. They cannot see the cross acting as their righteousness because they didn't figure it out for themselves. Just as the Jews say, well, Our righteousness is not found in a crucified man. Our righteousness is found in the law. The Gentiles say, well, we're not going to come to this Jesus because we didn't figure that out on our own. See it? It's a stumbling block to Jews, and it's folly to Gentiles. So let me repeat again the principle that Paul puts before us right here, okay? Don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. Here's what Paul is saying. God's wisdom is infinitely higher than our own preconceptions and thinking processes, all right? And to focus inwardly on our own wisdom is to miss the grandness of his. The cross separates the wise from the foolish. It separates the humble from the self-righteous. It separates the one who walks by faith in the results of that cross from the one who thinks he knows it all. That's what it does. It humbles those who belong to God. It becomes nothing but a stumbling block to those who do not know him. The cross of Christ does that. It is the wisdom of God and the power of God. To preach Christ crucified drives that kind of separation. The humble versus the philosophically superior. So then what Paul does in step 4 being bring some counterexamples and show you how this works. But then in step 5, he applies it. If you're going to make a rhetorical argument at some point, you got to apply it to the people. All right. Now, I've made plenty of application of this all the way along, and I think he has too. But if you're going to be a good rhetorician, you get to a point where you actually poke your finger in somebody's eye and say, here it is. He applies the principle to the matter at hand. Verse 24. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. See what Paul says? Here's the application. Let me just spring it on you right away, all right? I'm not going to make you wait. Here it is. The cross brings unity. It brings together everyone under a single word. Under a single word. It brings us together. Now, you will notice that it starts with the phrase, to those who are smart. Right? To those who are deft at looking at evidence and making conclusions. Right? Is that what it says? Is that what your Bible says? It's not what my Bible says. What my Bible says is to those who are called. Those who are called. Now, you know, it's easy to read this passage and kind of miss over that, isn't it? Really easy to just sort of read this and just skip right over that. But let me tell you, Paul is punching us right in the eye. Here's the application of it right here. The called, of course, are those who are summoned, invited, appointed. All these kinds of words are used in the New Testament to translate this word autos, kletos. Those who are called. Even Jesus himself in Matthew 22:14. Many are called, but few are chosen. And it's obvious that Paul here is referring to what he obviously believes in every aspect of his teaching. We don't have to spend a great deal of time defending that Paul believes he's talking about the elect. Yeah, I know. A whole lot of people don't believe that God elects anybody. He just calls them in some sort of neutral way. I'll just stand here on the corner with a, whatever they call those boards, you know, you have one on the front, one on the back. I'll just kind of stand here, big foam finger, and, you know, go like this. Come, everybody. And anybody who wants to come, just come. That's how people interpret this word calling, but that's not how the New Testament interprets it, not even close. Paul believed in a people who were foreknown, predestined, and called by the power of God to Christ. And that this power of God not only transformed them, but filled them with the ability to believe and faith. Those who come together as a unique people because of the purpose and plans of God. Not because of something in us. Not because of something he sees inherently in us. Not because of something that we're so good. But simply because he has purpose to accomplish something in this earth through creation and redemption and glorification and consummation. Because he is doing something. And it is a people that are set aside to him. You know, we teach that here at this church. Surprise, surprise. We teach that here. We believe that God has a people that he has set aside to himself. They're his people. He knows them by name. His son came into the world to die for them explicitly and purposely, and the Spirit went out into the world seeking them out and raised them from the dead. We believe the New Testament teaches that unequivocally. And Paul says it right here. To those who are called, this cross means something. It's a people not only who are called, but this is also important, they are unified in that calling. They're unified in that calling. They have one common purpose, which is to honor Christ Jesus the Lord. They have one common worship, which is to worship Christ Jesus the Lord. They have one attitude, and that is humility before Jesus Christ the Lord. If I had to summarize what we believe as a church, I would say it like this. We believe in the sovereign God who calls Christ at the center and us to humble faith in him. It's that simple. And that's what Paul's talking about here. For those who are called, it's those who have come together. Paul says, Corinthian brothers and sisters, listen to me. Listen to me. Your unity is not around these things. Your unity is around him. Because your calling is in him. And your unity is in that call in him. And he goes on to say it explicitly. To those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, I don't care what your ethnic stripe is. I don't really care about your gender or your skin color or your economic class or any of those sorts of things. Those who are called from every tribe and every tongue and every nation, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. It is all about him. It's all about him. Jesus Christ as the completeness, the fulfillment of God's purposes in all the earth. Now, in my notes I wrote the completeness of God's purposes of redemption in all the earth. Strike the words of redemption. True, he is the purpose of redemption, but not just the purpose of redemption. He is the incarnation of the totality of what God purposed in this world. The fullness of God's wisdom is on display in him. The fullness of God's power is on display in him. Did I say that loud enough? You know why I say that loud? Because that is the point, isn't it? We are called as the elect. We are called to Christ. We're not called to a mansion in heaven or streets of gold. We're not called to a ticket in our pocket that gets us into heaven. We're not called to profess Christ in here and then go out there and live in the old way that we want to. We are called to Christ, which means that everything about us is His. Period. And therefore, the words that come out of our mouth should be about Him. Jews and Greeks, everyone of every stripe, is called in the gospel, in the preaching of the cross, to Jesus and away from themselves. This is the point and the application he's making to the Corinthians. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Okay, I've already said that in a different way. But the foolishness of God and the weakness of God is far greater than anything in us. Now, let me just pause and insert something here, because our natural inclination as human beings and go, okay, what would be weak in God? What would be foolish in God, right? That would be our natural inclination. We would look at this verse and go, you mean there's something weak about God that's stronger than us? That's not what Paul is saying. Now, I know that would be our natural inclination, but Paul's not suggesting that God is foolish or weak in some way. We serve a God who is all-wise and all-powerful, okay? When you put the word all on the front of it, omni, right? When you put that word on the front, there's nothing left to be unpowerful or unwise. God is all-powerful and all-wise. There's nothing in God that's foolish. Nothing in God that's weak. He's not suggesting that. He is suggesting, however, that even if these things, the cross, the resurrection, are foolish and weak, they're foolish and weak by human standards, not by ours. I mean, by His. By His standards, they're His wisdom. By our standards, Jewish standards, Greek standards, foolish. But you see, when Paul says, look, even if they are foolish to our minds, they are the fullness of the wisdom of God. The preaching of a cross is the preaching of great power. The preaching of the cross is a preaching of great power because it is the preaching of something that could actually save. Not maybe save. Not, Christ did His part, you do your part sort of thing. You spell that P-F-F-F-T. No. The preaching of the cross is the preaching of God saves by the death of this man. Believe that He died for you. Run to that cross. Drop everything else that you have. Your religion, your traditions, and your liturgies, and everything else you have. Drop it all. Drop it all. And run to that cross and grab a hold of it with all your strength. And hold on. And hold on. The preaching of a crucified man producing redemption is the preaching of great wisdom. Because every other philosophical line of thought leads you away from God. Eventually. Leads you away from God. But the preaching of the cross, the preaching of this thing, the crucifixion and its corollary, the resurrection, leads to true salvation. It leads to life, real life. Again, I say to you, God's wisdom is infinitely higher than our own preconceptions and thinking processes. And to focus inwardly on our own wisdom is to improperly relate to one another. To focus inwardly on our own so-called wisdom is to improperly relate to one another. Because you see, when everybody in the room is focusing on Christ, they will relate to one another perfectly. But when they start focusing on things other than Christ, guess what happens? Boing! You spell that B-O-I-N-G. Paul is condemning the so-called wisdom of the Corinthians. By turning their attention to these various petty matters and dividing themselves, demonstrates two things, as I've already stated long ago, but here we go again. They have lost the centrality of the gospel. They have lost the centrality of the cross as the mission of the church. And secondly, they have lost that sense of humility before the cross amongst themselves as a church. In other words, Paul doesn't just give here practical instructions on how to properly equate one another to one another, but he drives at the heart of the matter. He drives at the fact that these are a people with a lack of genuine humility. That's their problem. And he will go one step further than that as we proceed beyond verse 25. Because when he says in verse 26, "For consider your calling, brothers," see that word again? What he's going to do is he's going to then go on and discuss who they really are, and this case would be in the eyes of the world, to solidify this point, to really drive it home. But Lord willing, we will look at that in 2 weeks after we hear a message laid on the heart of Dr. Moeller next week.